Hi, welcome to Innovating Leadership, Co-Creating Our Future. I'm your host, Maureen Metcalf. I'm the founder and CEO of the Innovative Leadership Institute. We help elevate the quality of leadership across the world and work with those leaders to co-create a thriving future. Our work includes assisting leaders in identifying the disruptive trends that are impacting them and developing strategies to transform themselves and their organizations to thrive now and in the future. I'm a regular contributor to Forbes and the lead author on an award-winning book series focusing on innovating how you lead and transforming your organization. I'm also a fellow with the International Leadership Association. Today, I am delighted that we're going to talk about democracy and referendum with Matt Qvortrup. Matt is a professor of political science at Coventry University. He is described by the Financial Times as a world authority on referendums. He's published more than a dozen books on democracy and presented on the BBC program, How to Kill a Democracy. So Matt, welcome. What do you want to tell our listeners about your background before we jump in?
Well, you pretty much oversold me there. I mean, I'm obviously pale into insignificance at your achievements, but yes, I am a political scientist. I was a lawyer in a previous incarnation, and it seems these days that law and politics sort of tend to go together, especially in your country, but that's another story. My interest is how to make societies better, really, and I think that goes through democracy and giving people responsibilities so they can take responsibility for their own actions so they can become responsible.
Well, and your work is so foundational right now to what's happening in the world. What drew you to this area?
Well, I think most of these sort of things happened by accident. In the 1990s, here showing my age when I was a student, I wanted to write about elections. And my supervisor in Oxford said, well, a lot of people have written about that. You should write about referendums and populism. That's a nice little area. It's not going to be that timely, but it's a good thing to write a PhD thesis about, which I then started to do. And then, of course, things, I was about to say, then the rest is history. So I started out in a sort of academic way with an absolute pure academic interest. And then I realized this is it's quite a scary thing with referendums. They're referendums, it's a bit sort of like a Sergio Leone movie. They're the good, they're the bad ones, and they're the ugly ones. And recently in democracies, we've had more ugliness than we've had goodness.
So for our listeners who are less oriented in the political space, what is the study of referendums? Can you fill in a little bit more background?
Yes, the study of referendums is, in America, for example, you have ballot propositions. So at the same time as you have presidential elections or congressional elections, you vote on a number of issues. So when you vote on an issue, that is a referendum. So they voted in California a few days ago on whether Uber drivers should be given a salary or whether they're self-employed. Now that's an issue where the people themselves decide an issue. And I try to understand why certain countries, why certain states allow the people to have that direct say, and then or why certain countries allow them to have that direct say. And then also, when do they vote for a thing like that? When do they vote against it? And what are the policy implications of having a system where the people, or a majority thereof, decide directly on issues rather than transferring their decisions to elected representatives? And, that has kept me rather busy in the past few decades.
And so you advise political campaigns as well?
And governments. So I am in the fortunate position that this travels rather well in the times when you are allowed to travel. So last year I was in Papua New Guinea, which is an island state above Australia. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go there and suggest how they could have a fair vote. I've also been involved in votes all over the place, but including in America.
So our audience is international. So we'll be having a conversation with people from around the world. And depending on the topic, it is more American or less American. So what is your perspective on the state of democracy right now? You're writing about this during COVID, right?
Yes, you've got to have, I think Shakespeare wrote King Lear when he was sheltering from the plague. I'm not quite at that level, even if Coventry University, where I work, is very close to Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare was. But my lockdown project, my quarantine project, is called A Death by a Thousand Cuts. And it is a book about the death of democracy, but it's a subtle, not happening too fast, sort of the bleeding away, ever so slowly, so imperceptibly, of democracy. So I'm trying to write about I suppose it's throughout history, really, because there's always been a particular way in which democracies have died. It's very rare that we have democracies that are overthrown by a military coup. Most democracies are overthrown gradually. Somebody gets elected, claims to speak on behalf of the people, and then gradually assumes more powers, will typically appoint judges, will claim to be more democratic than the other ones, but then with control over the state, will monopolize power, and then suddenly, presto, you are in a situation where democracy is no longer. If you go back to the Romans, Caesar Augustus actually gave citizens to all the people in peninsular Italy. He said that they could even vote, and then they would send the votes to Rome, where he would be counting the votes, and therefore, not surprisingly, would win. And we see that same pattern there. Interestingly, in the Roman case and in many other cases, many dictators, many despots or demagogues have started by saying that democracy is stolen. Franco, the later became dictator in Spain, started his political career by saying that the 1936 election in Spain was, quote unquote, stolen. And then for that reason, obviously, things have to happen. And I'm not mentioning any particular people who might have followed the same strategy, but I think we have to be concerned when we see these tendencies. I'm not in this world to have a particular point of view. I am in the world to describe things. I'm a political scientist, but one of the things that I'm dealing with is democracies or the demise of democracies. And what I'm merely pointing out is that history may not repeat itself, but there's certain patterns that are eerily reminiscent of what things we've seen in the past. And I think people ought to know that so that they can make up their own minds as to whether they want history to repeat itself.
And so we're at the International Leadership Association conference. Do you have a particular message in the leadership space? Because we are recording this in the midst of the US presidential election while we're still waiting for a final decision on who our president will be. And so it's an interesting time to be having a conversation and to be remotely attending the ILA conference.
Yes, and I think one of the things that is interesting about dictatorship or demagogues or call it what you may, is that there are certain personality traits of those sorts of leaders. In a good leadership system, you have people who listen to experts. I think Machiavelli, the great Italian Renaissance writer, wrote in The Prince that the greatness of a leader is measured by the quality of his advisors. It wasn't gender neutral language in 1490 or when he wrote, but we can then, her greatness of her leaders is the quality of her advisors, if you like. But and he also has a whole chapter called Warning Against Sycophants. So, people who just say the right things. And the danger of having people who are of a more sort of despotic persuasion is that to their followers, they gain legitimacy by saying, well, I have God-given powers. I am the chosen one. I am all of these things. And therefore, I don't need to listen to people. I don't need to be humble because I know what is right. And I think that is the danger from a leadership perspective, is that if you then have that view that you have a monopoly on power, that you know all the right things, whether it's on tropical hurricanes hitting your country or whether it's on COVID or whatever it is, then you close yourself off to the possibility that you could be wrong. And therefore, societies tend to be worse if you have these authoritarian personalities, whether in dictatorships or in democracies. So from a leadership perspective, you need to have leaders who are aware that they may not be the brightest candles on the cake, but who are able to delegate powers out to other people. And then they would have an idea, a philosophical vision of where you want to go. Now, I know we don't want to just talk about the American examples because we are an international organization, but most people tend to know the American examples. And if you take somebody like Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican president at the time when I was growing up, then Ronald Reagan was much ridiculed for getting briefed on the golf course, and he would get little video VHR tape, it was, with 10 minutes briefings, and people say, "Oh, that's about his extension span." And actually, what was interesting about Ronald Reagan was that Ronald Reagan had exceptionally good people to advise him, and then he would get the sort of 3 bullet points from that, because Ronald Reagan had a vision for where America was going to be, but he was willing to and humble enough to delegate powers out. Ronald Reagan was probably not the most intelligent president you've ever had, but he was aware of his lack of intellectual prowess, and therefore he was able to delegate out. Another American president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was the same. He said, "Well, I'm a big guy from Texas, and I need these people to advise me, but I have a vision for what America can be." And the same, I think, is true if you look at great business leaders, if you look at great sports coaches. Those are people who have the greatness, they have the self-confidence to listen to people, to be able to take advice for those people who may have the right ideas. And we have a whole universe of ideas, and nobody can know everything perfectly well. So I think from a leadership perspective, the reason why I'm interested in dictatorship is not, I'm interested in its own right, I suppose, but the main sort of instrumental reason why I write about it is because these kind of systems where you have one individual who calls all the shots tend to be suboptimal, to use an economist's term, because they assume that you have all the knowledge, and you never have all the knowledge. You always need other people. So great leaders are the leaders who are humble, who are willing to listen, who are willing to delegate, and who have the ability to choose advisors who will support them and also speak truth to power.
You know, as you're saying that, I'm looking at our leadership competencies, and I have not done any work in the political realm. My COVID project is writing a textbook for healthcare leaders. So slightly different arena, but we both chose to write books during lockdown.
I know very little about the world of medicine and healthcare, but I think if you're a great surgeon, you would be happy to accept the advice of other people. So I think it's regardless of whether you're in healthcare or in oil or whatever you're in, you need to be open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
So in fact, I'm looking at our list of competencies. The first is professionally humble. I know where I am not the smartest person in the room or in the industry or in the field. And these things are moving so quickly that good leaders must be willing to seek input from others. And also, and this is what really, as I'm listening to you from the political arena, being clear on my principles, the principles of the party and the principles I hold, and living true to those principles, which connects then to the inspiring and vision. This is the vision we have. Then another is innately collaborative. So I have to seek input from others to ensure that the best outcome happens. Because again, Ronald Reagan didn't have all the answers, and we certainly don't now in our more globally interconnected and complicated world.
I couldn't agree more. But I think one of the problems that we then have is that we would then have to ask ourselves, why is it that people that feel this urge to go for leaders who have that sort of personality? And I think that's sort of the next big issue, because people often like to have not to do too much, really. I think the alternative to the sort of delegating all power to somebody that is seen to have supernatural powers is very dangerous, because you then you lose your influence. And I think what we should do really is to find ways in which we can be more inclusive rather than exclusive. And people should also, I mean, this is not really a leadership point, it's more back to the democracy point. People need to become, responsible for their own lives and responsible decisions.
I think that's the headline to me, is as busy as we all are living our lives and taking care of families and doing our work and staying healthy, that being a good political citizen, just an engaged citizen, is foundational to a healthy democracy.
And one of the things we, for example, at the International Leadership Association's conference, one of the participants is from Mexico City, Greta Rios, who has been instrumental in setting up this participatory budgeting, where ordinary people can decide on certain parts of the social security budget in Mexico City. It's not as if these people have massive massive resources. It's not as if any of them are economists, but they know that it's their lives. And therefore, people in Mexico City are willing to spend time and actually are given the opportunity to become responsible. And when they're given this opportunity to become responsible, they are no longer irresponsible, but they become responsible, literally, citizens. The same system has been pioneered in Brazil, also with great effect, where people feel that they're now part of lives. They become much less skeptical, they become much more trustful because they cannot distrust themselves. And being part of the process has then had tremendously good effects at the local level. Now, of course, there might be other sort of at the macro level problems in both Brazil and in Mexico, but at the local level, and if all politics is local, that is an empowering situation that I think we need to find all those examples of where people can become empowered through certain institutional structures.
So we started with your book and the chipping away at democracy. Do you have any thoughts on what helps us put those chips back? I don't know what the right terminology is, but if we're slowly losing that foundation, is it in service of something better, or are we losing something that's really good and we don't even notice it?
I think there's always a danger that you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Say, I don't like this, and then you're walking away from it. I mean, that's most people in their private lives. You get upset with your partner and you slam the door, and then it takes months before you make up again and make. We always, as human beings, have this tendency to overreact and do things that we then live to regret. It's just that it has immense consequences if you do that at the political level. In some ways, it would be foolhardy for me to say, well, there is a magic bullet that's going to solve all these problems. First of all, we need to be aware that history has, on occasion, rather repeated itself. I mean, there have been certain times where people have been trying to appeal to populist sentiments. They then get into power. They then follow a particular pattern that seems to be pretty consistent across the board. So if we know what the history has been like before, then we may also be more likely to prevent ourselves from reliving history. So I think history, proper history, can actually be used in a useful way. But then, of course, the other thing is that we can have to see when, how did it work? Like if we take America as an example, It was interesting. About 100 years ago, there was a movement called the Progressives. Now, America at the time was a place where they had just introduced instant communication technology. It was this novel thing called the telephone. Yes, where you could instantly communicate from one side of the country to the other. You didn't need the Pony Express or the stagecoach and all the rest of it, or even the telegraph. You could instantly communicate. It was a time where a lot of people were skeptical of the elites. They were skeptical of people getting filthy rich. Those were the people who built the railways. And they were skeptical of immigrants with a different religion who sometimes were terrorists. Those people of a very different religion were Catholics from Ireland and Italy. But some of them, of course, were quite violent. And one of the things that happened in America at the time was that America became more democratic. You started electing directly the senators. There were provisions for recall of certain politicians, very rarely used, but he was there as sort of as what Woodrow Wilson called a gun behind the door. And you also had opportunities for, if you like, bypassing the legislatures if they were seen to be too corrupt. I don't know if we can just go back, but to that, but I think America, because America followed that particular route, America then stayed with a number of caveats. If you were black in the South, of course, it didn't count for you. But in those parts of America, in the North, in the West, that has always been democratic, not in a party political sense, but more democratic in the actual sense of the word. That country, that America, stayed democratic, whereas other countries, Italy, Germany, and so on, that started exactly at the same level around the turn of the century. Argentina, for example, all of those countries did not introduce those mechanisms for empowering their own people. In all those other countries, because they didn't do that, they then fell prey to demagogues. So I think the way to resolve some of these problems is not for the people to elect demagogues. It is for the people themselves in different ways to take responsibility and find ways in which we can actually engage because it's much easier to criticize the elite than it is to criticize yourself. And if you only have yourself to blame, you may be a little bit more practical about things, a little bit more open-minded, and a little bit also mindful that things don't have a simple solution.
Thank you. That's incredibly insightful, as again, we're in the midst of the counting process for our election, and we had record turnout of all time. Now we have more people in the country, but we had record turnout. So there is the possibility that more people will be actively involved because of the divisiveness that's happened in the last 4 years.
I think the divisiveness itself is not necessarily a problem. You can't agree with people. It's good to have disagreement. There was a famous book by Samuel Huntington about American democracy called The Promise of Disharmony, saying, well, we can't agree. That but occasionally when they're really important issues, we will have to agree. And I think in some ways, I tend to be an optimist. I think the big question for America and the world at the moment is democracy a brittle twig? Or is it a bamboo stick that would flip back with vengeance if it's being bent? So either it's a twig that breaks when we try to bend it, or it's a bamboo stick that comes back with immense force when you try to bend it.
So on that thought, we're going to go on break. We are with Maureen Metcalf and Matt Qvortrup, and we are talking about leadership and democracy and referendums at this point in time where across the world we are seeing our democracies tested. So we will be right back. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back to Innovating Leadership, Co-Creating Our Future. We're talking to Matt Qvortrup and Maureen Metcalf, and we're talking about referendums and democracy. Before break, Matt, you said, are we a brittle twig or supple bamboo? I am hoping that we don't end this interview with Great Depression and telling us that we have to just start over, that we are in fact bamboo, but please answer that question and why.
Well, I think the most important thing is of course whether we're one or the other. And if we are bamboo, then I mean even a bamboo can break. I mean you can only bend it so much. I think democracies tend to be bamboo sticks or poles or whatever we call them. And I think the reason why we can't just say, oh, well, democracy broke down in Germany and in Spain, we're not seeing exactly the same. I mean, in Nazi Germany, there were more SS troops than there were policemen, and they were going around beating people up with impunity. There's nothing of the sort in any country around the world. Even the democracies that are being very challenged cannot be compared to what you had in those days. Having said that, so they're not twigs, as it were. I mean, they are bamboo sticks. But I think the stress test that we're seeing at the moment, even that will have limits. I think that in some ways, democracies have hit back. And maybe I ought to say, well, democracy, of course, is not a thing that is sort of like God-givenly right. I mean, but it's just the reason for having democracies, the reason why democracies are worth fighting for is because they tend to give better results. I mean, democracies are richer, they're fairer, they are greener, they are more socially equal. So on every single parameter, notwithstanding what they're saying in China and Russia, democracies work. Interestingly, in China, where there was a doctor at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2020, when we were recording, who said you ought to wear a mask because there's a thing called COVID. That was in Wuhan, in China. He was hurled before a Communist Party tribunal. He was punished. He was forced to swear in public that he had been very naughty and saying that. And then, of course, he died very terribly, very tragically. And as a result of the Communist Party's decision to say that they had all the answers, that they were infallible, as a result of that, literally millions of lives will have been lost and tens of billions of dollars will have been squandered, which could have been prevented if you just had a system where people had simply been allowed to say what they thought, what they meant, what they believed. So democracies are well worth fighting for because they allow that diversity of opinion that enable us to correct ourselves. The fundamental thing about the system of democracy is that it's a system where we can learn from our mistakes, we can correct people. Amartya Sen, who's a great Indian economist who won the Nobel Prize of Economics, said that there's never been a famine in a democracy because the opposition party would just never tolerate that. If you take a country like India, India's been very, very poor, but there's never been a famine in India because there have always been opposition politicians who would say, wait a minute, you're doing this badly, and then people would be held to account. So democracies tend to be efficient because they allow the opportunity of correcting our mistakes. And it is for that reason that we need to protect them. And also it might be for that reason that they tend to be quite resilient from attacks, because you need to chip away quite a bit before a democracy breaks down, which is a positive thing.
So at this point in time, not only in the US, but around the world, we're seeing populism and the opposition is becoming more virulent, stronger.
Yeah.
The divide is more extreme. I hear you saying that means it's also working. Is there a need to start to bring people back together, to heal, to unify, or is the division actually a sign of health?
Well, I think the division can be a sign of health. I think it's interesting that that in dictatorships, of course, there is no opposition because you say we're all in it together. Of course, you need to get together on certain things, and if you start talking about your opponents as if they have horns and tails and they're evil and they're socialist or they're whatever they are, that is really not helpful. I mean, at the end of the day, it is called the Commonwealth. I mean, certain American states and in Britain, I think it's in Virginia, for example.
Yeah, I grew up in Virginia. It was the Commonwealth.
Yeah, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's a Commonwealth against or versus somebody in court cases and things like that. In Sweden, if now we are being an international organization, they talk about society, and the Swedish word for that is samhället, which is the thing that glues us together. The Swedes also talk about their society as the people's home, the home of the Swedish people. And that idea, it does not mean that people in Sweden don't argue. I mean, they argue a lot. They argue as angrily as they do in America. But the important thing is that there are certain things that is for the common good, for the commonwealth, for the holding of society together, for the samhället. And I think those are the things we need to go back to. We have to say, well, we fundamentally disagree, but we all have to be here. In the Netherlands, we now think of the Netherlands as being a society which is extremely tolerant and all the rest of it. But one of the things that is characteristic of the Netherlands is that there are some people who are completely secular and who live, some people call Amsterdam the Sodom of the North, and it's sort of very much in your face. At the same country, you have people who are extremely religious, who are, very sort of Protestant and so on, but they agreed that they all have a common problem. They don't want to be overwhelmed by the North Sea. So much as they disagree on ethics and morals and so on, they need to agree to build the defenses against the water. Also in the 1930s, they might have disagreed on all sorts of moral issues, but they needed to have a defense policy, so they weren't going to be overwhelmed by the Germans. And I think we need to find a way in which we can identify the problems that we all consider to be of great importance, and then work together on those, and then gradually see what kind of compromises we can come up with on other issues. And I think the danger is that we become partisan for the sake of being partisan. And of course, we need to get together, but we don't need to get together just for the sense of healing and so on. It can be an empty phrase. We can't be divisive and find division. But having as I said before, the promise of disharmony, or the system that has, in the American sense of the word, checks and balances, where different little factions sort of cancel each other out. That is a healthy thing. It is a healthy thing to debate. It's a healthy thing to have disagreement, but it's also a healthy thing to say at the end of the day, we need to move on. We can't just talk about it. And I can live with this. I can live with that. Somebody defined a compromise as a solution that everybody is unhappy with. And I think we need to go back to that a little bit.
And again, Just being in the midst of the election in the US, it is more on my mind. So it looks like we may have a Democrat president, a Republican Senate, and a Democrat House. So those checks and balances will be in place. And we still have the court system that is non-political. So that sounds like, given your lens, it is a healthy place to start.
Yes, as long as they're willing to work together and talk to each other. Now, a lot of people will be interested in other countries, and there's the grass is always greener, and people tend to look at other places. I wrote a book a couple of years ago about the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and she's sort of seen as a voice of reason. I mean, she's got a doctorate in quantum physics and other things, just for good measure, but it's sort of seen as being a moderate. And what is interesting about the political system in Germany is that is a federal system as well. No party has overall control. So it's a coalition government of two parties that are fundamentally and ideologically opposed to each other. But somebody has to make a decision. You have to get things going. So therefore, in addition to having divided government in Berlin, you also have to fight with all the states, or not fight with the states, find a common ground, find a common solution to common problems. So if you are a mature person, then you sit down and you talk about it, you find a way that you can all live with. If you're an immature person, you say, well, it is my way or the highway, and I won't accept anything, and it's only going to be me. And here in the United Kingdom, we have a system which, when I went to university, I was told that our constitution is like North Korea's, except we have elections every 4 years. I mean, obviously, that's a caricature, but the British system of government is one where we elect a parliament, and that parliament can do literally whatever it likes to do. There are no checks and balances. And because we don't have a constitution, we can't be unconstitutional. So you can get away with literally anything. Now, we have the good sense of not passing any legislation, but not all politicians are like that. So one of the things in the German system, as opposed to the British system, is the German system forces people to compromise. And also, if you're forced to compromise, if you don't have a majority, then you're also forced to take into account other people's views. And if you take into account other people's views, then in the long run, you're all like to have social peace. But it requires you to accept a number of things that are completely unpalatable for many people. And you have to say, well, compromising means that I will have to accept things that I really don't like, but they will have to accept it too. And it's that level of maturity that I think we need to re-find. And that does not really help if you have politicians who do dummy spits and pretend or behave as if they're 4 or 5 years old, if that.
So as we use terms like arc of history, and as I think about the decision we make today and how it will play out over a decade or a lifetime, that opens up for the opportunity to compromise, because I'm going to have to live with it, as are you, my neighbor, community member, that it winning my way, if I look through the lens of legacy, looks very different than
Yes.
I want to win, because I want to win.
Yes, and I think you have to get out of the sort of like the playground kind of thing. Like it's if I can't have all the toys, I'm not going to play with you kind of thing. But I think it's also about being grown up. There was a book recently by a man called John Kampfer, which was about Germany, which was called Tales from a Grown-Up Country. And the thing about the Germans, of course, were the ones who were the most naughty, the most vile and evil in the past century. And they have learned it the hard way. But I think we should be careful not to learn. I mean, it's very important that we actually do learn how we can have a grown-up debate, we can have a grown-up society. And that means that you have to compromise on certain issues. And that might be even issues that I think it's that the problem is that sort of mentality of over my dead body. Am I ever going to accept that? The founding fathers, and sadly they were all fathers and they were all white, many of them slave owners.
Yeah.
So I'm not in any way saying that they don't have problems, but those people, notwithstanding some of the problems that they had, were mature individuals who realized that we have to find compromises. We have to find a system which does not allow one particular side of politics to bully or boss the other side around. And when somebody like James Madison was writing in the Federalist Papers about that, a series of articles that were published in New York in support of what was then the new constitution. And a lot of people did not like the constitution then, because they say, no, we need a system with a strong person, a strong power who can get things done. Now, the problem is that it's very good to get things done if you have all the right answers. The fundamental problem, a fact of the matter is that nobody has all the right answers. Nobody knows everything about science. Nobody knows everything about economics. And even those who are experts need to be corrected. So therefore, it's much better to have a system where we can have that sort of, if you like, beneficial kind of opposition, the disharmony that only urges us to come up with better arguments. We talk about dialogue and democracy and all of that. And for the Greeks, who were the first ones to have a democracy, for them, democracy was not just voting, it was also debate, discussion. And the argument was that you might start the debate with one particular view, and the other side will have another view. And then through the debate, and I think Plato, who's of course one of the famous writers and critics of democracy, says it's a bit like you're robbing two pieces of wood together. At the beginning, it's just two pieces of wood, but then the fire will spring out of that. In the same way it is with democratic debate. The two different sides of the argument will produce something which will produce a spark, in fact, literally, and produce flames that we could not foresee before. So we have to embrace the disagreements. We have to work constructively with our disagreements so as to overcome them, so as to come to a higher level, so as to improve the world. And I think there is a possibility that might happen.
It does describe a different mindset than I hear right now.
I fear you're right. I fear that I think somebody like Mitch McConnell will have to have a bit of tuition from me, which Mitch, if you're watching, just ring me anytime. You can find me. But equally, I think there are other people who may need to have the same level or go to the same classes. We could probably have sort of group therapy for them. I'm sure there are on the other side of the argument people who are equally unwilling to compromise. But I think it's and that's a part of why we need to have civics, why we need to have, we need to go back to actually the roots of what is it to be living in the Western civilization. It's always been the case. A lot of people say, well, there are all sorts of bad things about Western civilization and democracy and so on. Well, one of the things that's fundamental about the period that started off the Enlightenment was that people were willing to doubt. The fundamental thing about our society is doubt. If you want to be philosophical about it, Descartes, you ought to doubt everything. Was his strapline, it was great in 1630s. And that idea about doubt, that idea about having different, it was also Protestantism came in at the time, that you don't have one particular point of view, and that you have constructive criticism, constructive doubt. That is the thing that has brought societies forward. Science has grown as a result of trial and error. We knew Newton was right, then Newton wasn't quite right, and then you had quantum physics coming in. I know very little about this, I have to say, but everything we've done because we have been willing to test our opinions. Mm-hmm. And kind of get out of the 14th century, which we're sort of like fallen back into, which is sort of like the time of the literally the Dark Ages. It's interesting, actually, just now that I'm on a roll here, and maybe you can just correct me and stop me forcefully if I'm wrong. When we talk about the Renaissance and all of these things that we put for us, it's just paintings nowadays. There was a great man in those days called Pico della Mirandola, which is a wonderful Italian name. And Pico della Mirandola wrote a book called The Dignity of Man. And writing there in the 14th century, said, well, the reason why I believe in the dignity of man is because I've been willing to learn from the Arabs. Oh, he calls them the Saracens, but that's the people. And in those days, when Renaissance Italy really took off, when you had Michelangelo and all the rest of them, they became a great society because they were open to ideas from other places. They were willing to learn from other places, and most of what they had actually learned, they'd learned from the Arabs. I mean, they of course weren't Muslims. They disagreed with them. But great leaps forward in time have always come at times where people have been willing to criticize. the greatest moments in art history. If we go, that's the Greeks, they had a democracy. The Dutch, Rembrandt, Van Hals, and so on, lived at a time where you could debate things, where there was an open debate, where there was openness and room for disagreement. So all good things fundamentally go together. So all the Western societies and all the other societies need to embrace disagreement. They need to embrace critical thinking. They need to embrace critical rationalism, and they need to embrace, above all, openness to other people's ideas. When we get back to that, we're on a roll again. Until we rediscover those fundamental values of the Enlightenment, we're suffering a setback, and the danger is that setback sends us all the way back to the Middle Ages, because we have to remember that after all the Greeks and the Romans and all the rest of it, we had the Dark Ages for 1,000 years.
So what I hear then is that this dissonance can then fuel something that would be like the Renaissance if we are open to embracing the different points of view rather than trying to bludgeon them out of existence. And one of the things we talk about in leadership is the leader has to embrace the mind of the scientist, that current leaders, to be effective, have to certainly identify the biggest problems, develop a hypothesis, and rather than believing they will have the answer, they have to continue to test their answers, especially because they're solving multiple problems at the same time. And we always will going forward because of the pace of our world. So the good leader does look like a scientist than a command and control leader that built much of what we see right now.
Yes, except I think I would probably want to more embrace the sort of experimental artist in some ways, because sometimes scientists are stuck in their ways. I think one of the problems with science is that I think it's called paradigms within science. You only think within the paradigm. So if you're a physicist, then it's quantum mechanics and all of that, and you don't think that's
beautiful.
So I think the ones I would want the great leader to take notes from or learn from are the people who completely throw themselves into a different mold. And I think it's more likely to be the scientists who will try completely crazy new things. So we need to be much more improvising. I would rather be less Albert Einstein and more Charlie Parker.
Okay. So tell me, and we've got like 2 minutes to wrap up, but who is Charlie Parker and why that?
Charlie Parker was a great jazz musician. He was actually, as a human being, he was a particularly nice one, but he was somebody who always talked about the element of surprise. He said, well, my music should always be the note you don't anticipate will come up, because then it's new, then you get excited about it, and I should try things. And Charlie Parker, although he was a jazz musician, African-American, he would be immensely inspired by classical music. He would be open to that, and he would be open to thinking about literally anything that could inspire his music. He'd sadly died very young. He wasn't just thinking inside the box. In fact, he was just chipping away at the edges of the box, trying to get out all the time. And if we can have that innovative spirit, if we can have that thinking about things that can be new, that to cast ourselves in a different mold, that is the best way forward, I think, for leaders and for jazz musicians and for scientists.
Beautiful. So as we close, again, we are globally navigating populism. We are watching dramatic shifts, and I feel hopeful after talking to you about the idea of novelty and that the dissonance is actually healthy and part of a resilient system. Is there anything you would like our listeners to absolutely take away as a key point from the conversation?
Well, I would like to quote the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, who said in a play, "Fortunate the countries that have great leaders and great heroes, but more fortunate the countries that don't need heroes." So I think it's great to have heroes and idols we can look up to, but the most fortunate places are the places where people don't have a need to have a leader and to follow them, where they do it themselves.
Beautiful. Thank you. This has been quite a joy, and thank you to the International Leadership Association for putting us together and creating an opportunity for this conversation.
And likewise, it's been an honor and a pleasure.